Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to the workshop on sports. We're basically going to explain how to debate sports if you do not know or like sports at all. So, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to discuss a couple of aspects of sports, just basically what are sports, why are they fun, and kind of like who are involved in sports. I think those are the three broad categories that we're going to talk about. And I'm going to presume that you know absolutely nothing about sports, and it will be interactive. So there will be a couple of times where I'll ask like a question, or there will be like an exercise, and I expect you guys to like be ready, to have paper ready, or have a Word document ready, and then you can start doing the exercise. And I'm gonna ask you to answer it, and then we can discuss that together. Because the best way to retain information is to actually work with it. So, what are sports? So, basically, going to go through now just the basic concept of how sports look like. So the first kind of sport that you will see is just where there's one specific season. So there's just throughout the year, you just have matches and you have one season table. And the end point is you try to then get at the top of the table. So this is what you see here on the right is that you see, for example, this is football, this is the English Premier League. Most of the examples that I'll use will be from football, just because I'm more familiar with it, but also because it's a bit more difficult to have emotions about that kind of area. But what you see here, for example, is that you have the top one here. Liverpool at the end became champions, and that's basically what you want to get. That's where you get the cup. That's where you get money for placements, but also there's a big party everyone really wants to. Another kind of like interesting nuance is oftentimes what you'll do is you'll rack up points by just winning or drawing or losing. Same way that you would have like debating with placements. And the thing is, if you get high enough, you basically get placed for some form of European Cup. So if you look here at the blue, I think these are the ones for the get directly selected for a European, and then the fifth place is like a playoff. So you want to really get high, even though you might not get first, because it still means that you get access to the European Cup, and that's just an independent match, an independent kind of like knockout phase or kind of like season that happens parallel to the normal season that you have. If you get very low, so if you are 18, 19, 20th, you get relegated. The way this kind of works is you have different tiers of a specific kind of sport. So, for example, you have just the top tier of football, and then you have the second tier of football, and then you have just these leagues just have maybe a bit less attention. They're still oftentimes professional. They still oftentimes have big stadiums, all that kind of stuff, but they are oftentimes the lesser clubs, and then you just have this relegation and promotion that happens all the time. So, if you then are, for example, the champions of the second league, then you get promoted towards the first, the first league, and that's basically the way this kind of like happens. This happens for most places, especially in Europe, both the European Cup and the kind of like relegation. But there are some sports that actually don't have this. So in the US, for example, the NBA doesn't have relegation, and that comes with the problem that at the end, if you're relatively low on the table, it doesn't really matter because you're not playing for anything anymore. So the matches also become a bit boring and become less tense. Whereas if you're looking at it here, the lowest three here are basically fighting out to not get relegated. So it always stays interesting even at the end. Um, this, of course, is then besides different kind of cups that you can have. So you have these kind of matches, and then oftentimes what you then have is like for example, in the English Premier League, you have the League Cup or the Carabao Cup, and these are just kind of like knockout phases, knockout games. So if you win, you go to the next leg. And then if you go to the next leg, you kind of like go in. And if you go to the final, you win. So this is just akin to a debating tournament. These cups then also give you money. You get money from tickets. You get money if you like get to a specific level or if you win the thing. And again, here you can win a cup and then you can also get placed, for example, for one of those European leagues, so the Champions League or the Europa League or the Conference League when it comes to specifically football. I basically used only football as an example, but there are more team sports that are in here. So things like ice hockey or hockey, basketball, volleyball, all of these things have the same structure with promotion, relegation, with they've also their own kind of like European thing on top of it. This, of course, doesn't happen as much in, for example, the US because the US is already quite big, but this does also actually happen within Asia and in other places. So this is something that happens quite generically. So the second kind of sports that you have is just more of a tournament championship. So the main idea is just you have play a couple of tournaments. So this would be akin to debating. But then oftentimes what happens, there would be just immediately a knockout phase. And you would have an ELO ranking. And playing games and winning them basically gives you a kind of like ranking. And then if you want to enter these tournaments, you oftentimes need to have a minimal amount of like ranking. Or you can kind of like need to do a couple of like selection matches Uh, Again, you have a couple of requirements. So you have to still register at the national body to then see that you are a professional, and then you can like get a points towards it. And this is more normal for things like tennis, table tennis as well, athletics, golf or combat sports. All of those kinds of things tend to have this kind of format that you go for. Most of the things that I'll be talking about in the form of like club ownership and all that kind of stuff doesn't really apply that much here because this is often more of an individual side. But a lot of the other stuff about enjoyment and why people watch it still does apply. But this also shows there's a different kind of sport because there are still managers and there still might be agents who can help you and who can coach you, all the kind of stuff. But this is significantly more individual than the other ones, which is more teams and sports based and all that kind of stuff. And this is also to clarify, lastly, there is also international teams. So this is sometimes where people get confused. If you have something like the Champions League, this is not the same as I think the national games. So what you also have is I think like the FIFA World Cup, the Olympic Games, all of these kinds of things where you have national teams being selected based on nationality, not from clubs. So it can be that, for example, someone who is Dutch plays in the English Premier League, then still becomes part of the national Dutch team. This again has their own independent system. So this is you have training that happens in off seasons, for example, for your normal season. You still have like a national body who select who's the coach, and that coach then decides who basically gets selected to be part of the team. But it is still just from people who have that specific nationality. There are some nuances here where there's also sometimes a discussion if someone has a dual citizenship or is has parents from one specific region but is born in a different region. And basically the way that most of the times it's done is like if you have played a match in a national team for one of these specific countries, which you are eligible, which is quite flexible, then you're oftentimes locked into the country. So you can't first come out for the Netherlands and then afterwards come out for Indonesia. There's some exceptions for that, but that's the general rule for international teams. This is good to keep in mind. This is just a separate, again, level than just the overall seasons and overall tournaments that you have. Most of the motions will focus on the first rather than the latter. Again, this is just going to be a lot of framing and setup of just how sports work. If you are already any questions, just raise your hand or please let me know in the chat. But I hope this is all clear. And then we can go on into a bit more detail about why people actually enjoy it. So I see no hands, I see no comments. So I'll just move on. So another kind of like general question that sometimes people just don't know is how do people watch sports? And this is there are different ways that this happens. So what happens is when you go to, for example, watch full games, you can either go to the specific stadiums and watch them. And sometimes people are saying like, these are not necessarily as accessible. But oftentimes there are ways around this. So it's not just about using cars, public transport, but also what tends to be happen is fan clubs, or like from the sport clubs itself, organize fan buses. So that just means that you put everyone who's like a fan like in a bus and then you travel them from one city to the other city. There are a couple of reasons for this. It's cheaper. It's also way more organized, and then you don't have, for example, a lot of people needing to go at one specific time with public transport, which might just offload it. And yeah, I don't have the problem of different fans clashing with other fans. So actually, there are quite some mechanisms to still make this accessible for quite some people. But also, there's also the majority of people because watch this actually via just live streams or via just watching TV where they can see the full match. This is specifically true for all generations. It's a bit hard to get like the full statistics, but if you look at the most statistics, especially people who are like 55 plus and older, they are watching the full games and they have like that rate for like I think 70% of fans who are 55 plus watch it that way. They are less likely to use like summaries or to use other kind of media. That's more for the newer people. So another way to watch it is not to watch the full game because that's kind of like might be very long, might be somewhat boring. Um, so what is especially popular amongst younger people, so these are like the 18 to 25 range, is just using things like TV. So oftentimes these are summaries of like the different matches that happen during the day or during that weekend, which are then, freely available on TV. So this could be, for example, the BBC for the UK. In the Netherlands, it's NOS, just the public, the public agency who has their own channel. Um, and I'm saying freely here in the sense that, if you have a TV and you have a TV license, then you can watch it. You don't need to have an extra subscription. If you want to watch the live streams or that kind of stuff, it does tend to cost money. And it has to be somewhat expensive because people know that they really want to watch it. Another kind of thing you can watch is you can have online, so you have like stream services outside of these things, so like via Play or also just like a YouTube uploads where people watch these summaries of these matches. So the sport's actually relatively accessible to watch, and this is oftentimes good kind of like to know how do people actually engage with it. So this is just again set up for people who do not know anything about sports or who do not like sports and do not know how people engage with. This is just this is the basics of how people engage with sports. Now to get more stuff that you can actually use a bit more in the debating side of it. So why are sports fun? And if you've had a couple of sports debates, there are a couple of generic things that you see. A couple of the things is that it's kind of like very interesting to have a team where you can like see if they can win or lose. Another kind of thing is that oftentimes people have played football or like play football, for example, casually with friends. And now you see people do tricks that are way better than you. And then that makes it significantly more interesting because you're seeing a skill that you kind of have or that you kind of know and you know how complicated it is. Um, the thing though that sometimes people just lose out on is explaining why this is necessarily unique. Because oftentimes when people say like, sure, it can be very fun, but it can also be very fun to watch Love Island, and it can also have a lot of like things where I can just have enjoyment. What kind of like makes unique about sports? I think there's a couple of things. Firstly, it is a very good structure in sense of like it's recurring. And it doesn't mean it's like every single year there is a season and every single week there is a game. So this is something that's just a very structured way to get like enjoyment and get like a community out of. Whereas, X on the Beach at some point kind of like stops and at some point will also, you find a new series and might even get cancelled. But also the specific thing is people really, really care about sports. So they often see it as an extension of themselves. So this might be because they have chosen for a specific club or they have been raised up with a specific club. They have specific ties to it. So it might be that, for example, they have a lot of memories from their parents going to the stadium, and those become core memories or like core valuable things that they remember their parents by, and those kinds of. And because you see it really as an extension of yourself, it's really something where everything gets significantly more heightened. Um, and I think again, this kind of like generic line, I think people tend to know a bit, but I think it's specifically about what makes sports unique, which I think is interesting to work on. And the thing with families, I think, especially interesting because one of the benefits of having something that happens every week is it becomes a sort of ritual. And the ritual is something that is quite nice in the form of even if there are fights or disagreements, you still come together and watch football. You still have something that you cheer in favor of or against. So there's a very connective tissue that happens continuously. And it also becomes a very good place to create shared memories. So, as a kind of like example, like I used to watch the national team of the Netherlands play against other teams with my grandmother. My grandmother passed away, but every single time that I'm still watching the game, it still kind of like feels like she is there because like I still have all of those memories. I still get remembered of those events that happened. And I think that these are the kind of things where the recurring part is important. Like you feel closer, you feel connected, and it brings families together in this kind of way. And that is another way to kind of like frame this. Similarly, you could talk about like friends that it's often very hard for people to get friends, especially later on when they're more adults and they have less, opportunities or avenues to really engage people socially. Having a structural way they could just see the lads with whom they had, maybe went to high school with, or just, maybe met with the fan club. It's a good way to just create a strong community and get the shared value that you normally don't get in everyday life. So these are just kind of like why sports are fun. And I've already been yapping for a bit, which just means that it is time for an exercise. Let's just say you have this motion, which is this house would implement $1 million salary cap for athletes. It's just quite generic. Um, let's say you're going to make the argument smaller teams can compete better with bigger teams. The intuition here of like why is this true is the fact that players from small clubs don't necessarily get drawn to big clubs with big money anymore. They're much more like to stay at a small club because they say get the same money. They can be kind of like the hero of that specific club. They might also be a better bargaining position for like, adapting to the play style, all that kind of stuff. So therefore, they're much more likely to stay, as well as like the smaller clubs can just buy better athletes because they can't be outbid by the big clubs. So they can also just get externally more athletes. Just assume that those are completely proven. those are not attacked and those are true, then the question and the exercise that I'm going to give you now is just how would you impact this case? Just, I guess, take roughly 2 minutes for this and then we'll come together. Okay, there was quite some time. I think that should be enough for people to have an idea of the impacts they want for them. Does anyone want to come forward by either putting it in the chat or just unmuting themselves and tell me the impacts that they would go for?
May I?
I heard someone unmuting and then muting themselves again. If you want to go,
Oh
go
yeah,
for it.
may I? Okay, so I thought two stakeholders to impact on the athletes, their work conditions and career, especially for our athletes starting smaller teams, and the sport itself in terms of spectacle, how it gets better and better. And third, the enjoyment and feeling of justice of fans from smaller teams, because as we said, it's an extension of themselves. So if they see to fight with the big lions, they feel prouder and they engage more, and they this enjoyment and unique sentiment and
Yeah, you cut out because I think you muted yourself again. But I think, yeah, those are, I think, okay. So it's like the athletes, kind of like the spectacle and the enjoyment. Um, I think for time reasons, actually, is there someone else who wants to have who had a different impact that they would run based on the idea that small teams can compete better with bigger teams?
Yeah, can I try?
Yeah, go for it, Jim.
Like the main idea how is like how you create more parity in the tournaments and the cups, how like it's less likely for the same team to win over and over again, and this one affects like spectacle and how the fans interact with the teams. But secondly, when you don't have the same team winning for 10 years, 10 seasons in a row, this means that other teams have more money because of more viewers. This means that they can actually then put more money in the sports. This means it's better for the teams don't get discouraged and then drop off like to B category or anything like that.
Okay, those are, I think, all good thoughts. I'm gonna just show a couple of things that I want to note on the impacts that we have. So I think one of the traps that people fall into is they tend to explain, they just explain, for example, these small teams win more, which is good because then the fans feel happier. But the main issue with this is that sports, to a certain extent, is like I think it's a zero-sum game, if I'm using the concept correctly. The idea is just that, let's say, for example, Ipswich, which is a bad team in the English Premier League, is now performing better, and Manchester City is losing games. Ipswich fans feel happier, but the Manchester City teams feel shittier fans because they are losing more. So if you're talking about like overall utility or overall happiness, overall enjoyment, it seems to be not that much that you can add when you're just comparing those fans. Arguably, you could say actually it is good that Manchester City keeps winning because those have the most fans, and therefore the most people get the enjoyment, whereas only a small amount of Ipswich fans get this happiness. It doesn't weigh as much. So if you want to run that impact, which I think you definitely still can, is then you need to explain, for example, why it is that the happiness that these small teams get from just winning a couple of more times is so much larger than the dishappiness of Manchester City. Or you could just say maybe there's a principle here on like why it is that maybe these fans are maybe a bit more vulnerable, or why we should inherently care more about them, and therefore you could maybe use another weighting metric. But I think an important thing is to still do the thing of comparativeness. An alternative impact, which I think also both people touched on, is like idea of spectacle. So you have more sports, and you have better sports, you have more money put in, and you have better athletes. Then this means that there will be, for example, more spectacles. To a certain extent, the problem with this argument is that people in the 50s and 60s enjoyed sports just as much, whether someone can do like two panenkas or like one panenka, like in the final. Um, I think the kind of thing that the most best case to work on is just the thing where it comes by the tightness of the race. So for neutral viewers, neutral spectators, their fun it becomes more fun. I think one of the examples that you already like get with the second person who gave the impact was like if one team keeps dominating. One of the examples is Manchester City currently is kind of like, well, used to be dominating the English Premier League, where they won a lot of cups. Now they kind of like fell off, so they're doing less good. But the Bundesliga, you had a really big problem where I think for roughly like I think at least 8, 9 years in a row, Bayern Munich kept winning. And the issue of this is the games became so boring that teams who were playing against Bayern Munich in Bayern Munich stadium, the away fans would just not show up because they would know they would lose anyways. So you would just have stadiums which would not be filled because fans just would not watch it because they knew they would lose anyways. And I think this is another way to just explain really why it is that this really just hampers like the ability for people to enjoy the thing. Similarly, I think the athletes is also a good angle. I think most of the things that this will talk about is just the enjoyment of specific fans. Um, are there questions about this, like what I've said so far about like enjoyment? If you have any questions, you can also put them in the chat and I will respond to them when I see it. Because if not, I'll go to another side of it, which will be actually about fans. So there's again some generic reasons why just being part of a fan group is just quite nice. So you could say people can make friends. This is again the framing where a lot of, especially people who are like grown up, have a hard time finding time between like their family and their work to make friends. This is a very easy way to where there are a shit ton of people in the pub, or a lot of people in the stadium, or a lot of friends who maybe knows who also are friends we're able to connect with something. And it's also like a group that's relatively constant, like so it's kind of like a recurring thing in which you're interacting with, and it's kind of like a nice structure. Like so planning things in with friends always comes a bit hard, but when you always watch a match on Saturday and becomes part of your schedule, it is just something that you see more. You have more people you can talk about the issues. And also it's specifically sports is a very nice thing to be able to talk about because not only are there constantly new things happening where new athletes have like maybe injuries, or maybe an athlete got like sent off for doing a bad thing, but also there are a lot of angles from which you can attack it. So sometimes people can just look at, for example, what are the tactics that these teams have, or who should this team sign in order to become better or more competitive. But also it could be opinions, which is just I think this player is not great, or I think it is more interesting to watch a more attackive than maybe a more defensive style football. And like also this change. So you could say if you, for example, have a person who might, not make friends that easily, who might be like, neurodivergent or might be a bit socially awkward, there are a lot of ways they can interact with it. But also, this might be a good way to interact and bridge specific gaps. So it might be, again, people from different ethnicities who might still be very big fans of the same club that you are, but also maybe, maybe your dad is not the most socially comfortable and maybe the most sociable person, but then really likes specific fan or like a specific club, then you can just talk about that more easily. You can watch these things together. This is a good way to interact with these people. And these are, I think, kind of like generic kind of things. What I think is a bit less known is just the amount of divisions that also happen within fandoms, or fans of specific clubs. So there are teams who just absolutely hate each other. And I don't think this is just like ooh, there's a rivalry and we'll shit post it on Facebook. But in Italy, for example, if you go to a different kind of restaurant or a different part of the city wearing the wrong jersey, like you will get kicked out of the restaurant. People will yell at you, and people will like maybe throw a bottle towards you. Like these things are like actually divisive. Like people really have strong opinions against these other teams. Um, and like again, like if you want to go watch football in a club and you're cheering for the wrong group, someone might be a bit drunk and angry and like throw a chair at you. But also like during matches, there are a lot of things that can happen. So sometimes what you can have is you can have people who are in big groups together, who are drunk because they're drinking quite some alcohol, who are riled up emotionally, where this team is now an extension of themselves. And sometimes this is good because they can have enjoyment, they can let out, they can just breeze out all the things that happened during the week and all the issues that they had during work. But it also means that sometimes they just do really dumb shit. So this looks like fighting other fans when they are provoking each other. Um, for Feyenoord fans went to so Feyenoord is a club in Rotterdam, the Netherlands, and Feyenoord fans went for the Champions League to Rome to play football against another team in Rome for the Champions League. And basically, what those fans did, they got drunk and they destroyed like ancient Roman fountains, and that's why those fans are not allowed in those cities anymore. Specific stadiums will now not allow away fans in specific matches because there's too much fighting, or people will throw flares or firework or bottles in the field on players towards other fans, and therefore there's just like a lot of fights that can happen. And there's just, like I said, a couple of reasons why this works. So the alcohol, the in and out group, people feeling safe because they are one group and just getting swept away once like a group goes haywire. And to kind of like show you this, I have three specific examples that I want to talk about. So the first picture you see above here is from Ajax. So basically, we have this. Ajax is a pretty big club. It's a historical club. It has done a lot of things well. So like it won Champions League. Very big footballers like Johan Cruyff, if you know anything about football, like very big player, came from Ajax. At some point, Ajax started not performing well. They were basically doing shit. There was management issue. They had acquired players who were way too young, not experienced. There wasn't a cohesive line, so the management basically hired players which were not playing the same style as the coach wanted. There was infighting. The coach got fired. There was a new coach. That coach also got fired. Like there's a lot of like drama going on. It's like I said, it's X on the beach, but then recurring every single week, and something's going to happen every single week. Um, Basically, what happens is the hooligans fans got really, really bad, and they just went to their own arena and just broke this down and demanded the technical staff, which goes across like the hiring, to basically step down, and they wanted to change all that stuff. So when things go poorly and when mismanagement happens, like fans really, really get mad. They also wait up buses of like players and just tell them that they need to perform better or that they want like the coach to, stop being a coach and just go away. Another kind of thing is if you look here to the left, this was a qualifier match for a national team. So this is a national team. You had Albania needing to play football against Serbia in order to get into the Euros for the national team. Now, if you know anything about the Balkans, Serbia and Albania are not on the best terms. There are already some things that got taken into account. So fans from Albania were not allowed to come into the match, so there would be only Serbian fans. And basically, what happened is a drone came in during the match, which had a flag of Greater Albania, which includes parts of Kosovo, or that includes the whole of Kosovo, and also parts of Serbia. And as a consequence, one of the Serbian players kind of like got and tore the flag down. The Albanian players didn't really like that. They then therefore pushed the player away. then fans from Serbia who were in the stands went and stormed the pitch. And then basically the stewards and the police and everyone on the field basically had to fight off the fans because they were just basically coming down. And this is a recurring thing where tensions between different like countries and different clubs become like larger because of the already existing ethnic issues that exist. So another thing is you have really big fans. So these are like ultras. These are like really big fans who are oftentimes the ones that you see singing, the ones with the megaphones, the ones who are organizing the banners when they are in the stadiums. And sometimes you'll have that these ultra groups are linked with other ultra groups. So again, you have maybe, for example, a Croatian club who might be playing a um, Greek club in the Champions League. But because the Greek club has like a connection with the Belgrade club, and the Croatia club has a connection with like the with another club, then they might even just clash each other, not because there's a direct ethnic tension between, for example, the Greeks and the Croats, but because rather the connections of the fans uh, from like Belgrade and Croatia clashing with each other. So, for example, the Belgrade fans and ultras actually come to the match. They kind of like also try to like stir up the peace and try to antagonize the other groups. And these are kind of like actual issues that happen. So if you have, for example, emotions, there was a Zagreb UDC, which was about like forming a union of like Balkan countries where they are playing sports against each other. The ethnic tensions are just going to boil over and violence will happen, as these examples just kind of like show. And I think this is also why I'm talking about this in depth, is because there are just kind of like very harsh impacts that can happen in this context. Another last example is here, and this was before the Euros final of 2020. So in Germany was holding at the Euros final for FIFA, so for the national teams, and in the final you had England and Italy, and England and Italy don't have any ethnic tensions with each other. They don't really hate each other, besides maybe some banter. But even then, you basically had before the match even started a huge amount of like fans clashing with each other. And again, this is just large amount of people who are drunk, who are very passionate about like the football being antagonized, and then just doing dumb shit, and then just things escalating. So even when there are no necessarily pre-existing tensions, the fact that it's a very big game, it's a final, you want to win, basically means that people like will still clash, and these things will happen. So this is not always just like a nice kumbaya fence kind of thing that happens. So again, if there are specific motions about making a specific thing larger or including more teams or resolving specific kind of issues, there are ways you can try to mitigate it. You can not allow fans to be in the stadium. You can try to put in nets between like teams and between fans, all that kind of stuff. But oftentimes outside of the stadium, nothing can be stopped to stop these fans from coming, and then you still oftentimes have these clashes happening. Okay, now let's go to the next slide. Which will be identity politics. So this kind of like I think bleeds into what I was already talking about. So any sports motion can actually be discussed from a lot of perspectives. So you can do the kind of like discuss football as a religion, and then you're doing the kind of like ritualistic side or the community side that I already talked about, or the kind of like enjoyment side, and then you can make it kind of like a media debate, or you could talk about it in the form of like a narratives debate. And then you can talk about how sport can inspire people to do more sports and be healthy. I kind of like set kind of like standards for what we expect a kind of like athlete or like a good looking person to look like, or like a athletic person to look like. But another thing is you could just like IR and like identity politics as well. So the not fun part here is that there's still a lot of issues with fans. So there are a lot of like uh, groups of people who are, for example, heckling specific players with kind of like racist slurs, saying racist things, all that kind of stuff. Um, Partially, this is, you can say, because people just really dislike this group and really have these stereotypes. To a certain extent, this is also a kind of like mind game or kind of like a group thing where once this gets chanted, people join in. And therefore, it oftentimes becomes a wider issue than you might expect. This is also kind of like important to think about where you, for example, have emotion about whether you would, as a gay football player, like come out of the closet, is that a lot of these fans are still very conservative and are also very prone to doing really bad things when they are in such. But also always said when there are already ethnic tensions, like see the Balkans, then it oftentimes just becomes very hard to not have that boil over into the football side. Now, I've given you the very bleak picture of sports, but sports can also be actually very nice because it can also actually do the opposite. So you can also actually see other people from different countries, from cultures, doing well. So if you have, for example, the Netherlands, you look at the national team, you see people like Virgil van Dijk, you see other people who have a different kind of like ethnic background, and you see them do well, and this kind of like creates a positive like modeling effect for people who are from a specific minority. But also you just see that person being competent, being nice, all that kind of stuff. So it goes against maybe the stereotypes you already have. A very specific example of this is there was a research that was done, and basically Liverpool hired a specific player, which is Mo Salah. He's Egyptian, he's Muslim, and basically what happened is because Mo Salah is a really good striker, what researchers found was actually a decrease of Islamophobia, like Islamophobic slurs being used within Liverpool, and this is like partially attributed or like a lot attributed to Mo Salah being there. So there's also like real life like application of like why it's actually good. So this is interesting, for example, when you have the motion about the globalization of the English Premier League, which is about whether you have more teams, more people from like different regions also starting to play more for English teams. When you also have the English Premier League trying to mark themselves outside of England, is that these kinds of politics kind of like become amplified. So both the racist part, like the racist chants, but also like the actual good side where you see people from specific regions now getting way more attention and way more platform than they would normally get. Again, this is already me yapping for a bit. So I'm just gonna now give you another exercise if there aren't any questions. So this is a motion which is this has regards the importance of sports in national identity. And then my question is going to be, what arguments would you run on up? So again, I'm going to give you like 2 minutes, and then we'll come together. Good, I think that's enough time. Do I have any brave volunteers want to share their ideas?
Can I suggest something?
Yeah,
Okay.
go for it.
It creates a sense of national unity because perhaps that this country has like problems of internal like ethnic divides. If it's a football team that's come together that's, possibly made up of different ethnicities from different backgrounds, and they're all going together for one goal, people are more likely to feel united within their country, perhaps.
Yeah, that's I think a very good point. Um, but I don't want to give it a different kind of case they went for.
May I?
Yeah, go for it. Yeah, you're a bit robotic, so I don't think the connection is great, but if it works out, just go for it.
Yeah. So when someone wins with their flag in a sport, there is much more importance in the sport and funding in the sport. So because they believe that as a country they are good in a sport, so this national identity pushes for more development and support for.
Yeah, so I think you got cut off again. I think because of the muting, but I think the main point you were going for is you get more funding for sports, and that just has a lot of like other benefits. So if more people, for example, perform sports or there's more ability to do sports, it is not just good because we're having an obesity crisis or we're having a crisis where people are playing on like video games like Fortnite because it's addictive and they need to go outside and touch grass and get access to sunlight to get vitamin D to be happy again. But also like a very good thing about sports as like a specific benefit is that it builds up confidence in like your own body. Like you see yourself become better at something. You're kind of like confident that you know that your body can do a specific kind of thing, even if you're not the best at it. The fact that you are, still working out and still are doing something that makes your body move also has a lot of like actually mental health benefits. That's kind of like I guess, a sidetrack of the impact. So maybe a last person who wants to suggest a case. I'm up. Okay, then I'll just give you a couple of things that I thought of. So, I think one of the things you could just also say is just very easily when people are much more likely to this part of national identity, they're maybe much more likely to, for example, watch a football match in primary school with like the whole class, which means that more people become fans, for example. Or again, this becomes like a national thing. You're much more likely to get like maybe time off or like things to be organized that you maybe going to watch the match. And then slowly you maybe get to know players. And then because you know those players, you want to watch them in normal games as well. And then you get all the benefits you talk about people having like a nice community, all that kind of stuff. And I think the kind of like minority points already well touched upon. I want to again note a thing of nuance. So I'm painting here kind of like a kumbaya picture, which is minorities play football and they do it well, and then everything kind of gets nice. I think there are a couple like structural reasons that you can give for why these minorities are often quite good in football or sports. I think one is just to a certain extent just empiricism. So again, you can point to the Netherlands, you can put to like Germany and to other places where sometimes you do see like a high level of like minorities also within a specific country. You could say that there are also specific physiological benefits of specific kind of regions, but also there's oftentimes a kind of like culture where people really enjoy these sports and see this as a good way of maybe out of the system. So when they feel like, for example, school necessarily isn't for them or they aren't respected there, they can feel like when they are doing sports, they can have a way where they can get social recognition as well as get like a community and do something outside of the system that normally doesn't maybe cater to them as much. There's a couple like the structural reasons you can give for proving why it is that you have, for example, a lot of someone like Virgil van Dijk in the Netherlands. But the flip side is actually also true, which is that if the people are not performing great, then sometimes people again do become not really nice to them. So an example is here Ozil, who was of Turkish descent, played for Germany. He was a quite good player. But at some point, he started making some political statements. He shook hands with Erdogan. He kind of like antagonized kind of like the media. Also, wasn't performing well, and then kind of like the racist stereotypes and the racist problems kind of like came up again, and there was more social media hate against him, all that kind of stuff. So the way that you can kind of like then weigh this off is then saying which one happens more often. which one is more important, and kind of like how does this exactly look like. So you could say even then you still have, for example, a role model side to it. Even then you still have like maybe more funding that you can also get within these communities to them to access sports more, and then all the benefits that they could get. So again, this is just somewhat of a nuance on how this actually looks like in real life, giving you a couple of like real life examples that you can use. Okay, we're getting somewhat near the end, and this is good because now we're going to talk about the financial side. So I said you could talk about sports motions if it's a religion motion, a narrative motions, a media motion, but it wouldn't be a motion if you couldn't also make it about econ, and that's what this part of the debate will be about. So kind of like who owns clubs. So there are sometimes people who are just really just love the sports. These are people who just, for example, want to own a club because they really like sports. So, for example, Wrexham was a small club within England. I think maybe even Wales specifically, actually. And basically, it had two actors from Hollywood who are like, we want to actually support this club, make it, put more money in it, and they basically put that money in there. And this is quite good, you could say, because they just really love it and they really have the heart. But also, there's sometimes the idea that fans should own clubs. So, generic motion is like fans should own these kind of clubs. An example of where it actually works is the German Football League. So, the Bundesliga requires uh, fans to own the majority of the club. Now, this has some benefits, right? Because people really care about it. They're going to make decisions. But then you also have some of the generic way offs, which is just to what extent are these fans competent in what decision they're going to make? So, are they going to push for example, a very attacking play style? And if you don't if you focus on attacking and not on defending, then you still lose matches. Are they maybe going to be more spurious and more emotional and therefore want to sack the manager or like the coach quicker? Then maybe they should to give them time to really adapt to the team. You could also say that maybe in times of crisis, when they really own it, they're going to sell off their stock, which then leads to instability, all of that kind of stuff. You could also say that no, they really care for the club. They're willing to, for example, they want to make sure that the prices aren't that high. They are much more likely to put in actual effort in. So one of the clubs, for example, in Germany was struggling was FC Union Berlin. And what basically happened is they were unable to pay for a stadium and they were struggling financially. And what happened was that all the fans came together and they made that stadium themselves with just like their own labor and for free. And you can really show that here's where that culture of fandom becomes really important and the engagement of fans because they can also really help the club as much as the club can help them. And therefore you create this symbiotic relationship. Whereas if it's just, something else, then you might not have the relation as well. So for example, Tottenham Hotspur is an English football club. They have a new stadium, and to pay that off, they have really expensive beers. They have quite expensive entry tickets. They have quite expensive other kind of things. You could say when you have more of a fan ownership, they are less likely to go for this path to, for example, finance it. So they might try to finance them in other ways, maybe get like other extra ticket take and that kind of stuff. Other kind of issue with sports is kind of like sports washing. So the idea is that you have a country or a group of people who want to basically have a good perception or image, and therefore they're going to sport wars. So this could be, for example, the Qatar trying to hold the world or basically held the World Cup for football. You have Arab Tech sponsoring Manchester City, all that kind of stuff. The issue with this is the main issue that oftentimes is with these places that when you have a huge expansion of these new places, for example, Qatar, then these stadiums are made with like slave labor, really poor conditions, people die, they don't get paid well, all that kind of stuff. And you could just say that's just really bad for all these reasons. When it comes to kind of like oil teams, like oil companies, or like people who are affiliated to a regime owning a specific club, um, even like with my best abilities, I find oftentimes very hard to still explain why that's a specific harm. Because to a certain extent, people kind of like know that. Like like a Shell, for example, it's like an oil company and it's sponsored like Formula One teams in the 2000s and in the 90s. And we kind of like know Shell is still bad. Like you can still criticize it, but also it kind of like it's a bit hard to see maybe not how it can overlap with the first group, which is just the fact that yes, maybe someone might be a very rich Saudi Arabian guy and he owns, for example, an oil company, but maybe he also actually loves football and therefore buys a lot of football players who are very expensive to play for his club within Saudi Arabia. So sports watching is sometimes something that's like impacted in of itself as something like morally gray. I find it just in real life, it's a bit harder, or in debating, it's a bit harder to really argue about it from that perspective. It's sometimes more the specific first part, which is just you build infrastructure plans which are not used afterwards. That is often the more useful part of this sport washing. The last thing is investors, and they oftentimes just have a goal to make profit. So they can be private equity firm, investment, hedge fund funds, all that kind of stuff. So the example that I have here are on the slides. These are the Glazers. They own Manchester United. Manchester United was extremely dominant football club within England. They won the Champions League a lot. They was a period where they basically won the English Premier League so many times in a row. At some point, these two people, the Glazers, bought the club, and the way they did it was they leveraged the club in the buyout, which basically meant that the club got a shit ton of debt, and basically it needed to pay off that debt and pay off an interest rate. And these brothers basically made a shit ton of money off it. Um, this is kind of like, fans really, really dislike them for that specific reason, because not only did they give the club a huge amount of debt, in a way to then solve this debt, what they also did is they um, raised prices. They cut a lot of people. They fired a lot of people. They did a lot of things which just people fans were just not happy about. And I think this kind of like and as well as like they kind of like performed kind of like shit because for a long time they didn't give them a good transfer budget to kind of like get players, and therefore they also decreased overall. There are other issues, of course, with Manchester United, and I can go into a very long, detailed explanation why I think Manchester United failed. But I think that's more of something that we can do in a social after a tournament or like whenever than actually in this workshop, because I also have time restrictions. Um, but also, I think here it's kind of like shows what the specific harms can be. Of course, you can bring the other things, which is just if you have a more effective run, company, then you could talk about the benefits about like lower costs, just having better players, fans get, a new stadium, which they normally would be able to get, all of that kind of stuff. But I also wanted to give you just like a real life example of how this can be done poorly. And then the last part, I'll hope to do this relatively quickly, but there are, I think, two financial trends that I think are important to know. This is, again, a bit more focused on football, but I think this can still cross apply to a lot of sports. So what you now have is a growing amount of like multi-club ownership, which basically means that you have companies or a group of companies basically coming together and then buying different clubs in either different sports or in different leagues. So, for example, Red Bull, you might know, has a Formula One team, but it also does a lot of like extreme sports, but it also owns a lot of football clubs. So they own a football club in Germany, RB Leipzig. RB actually doesn't stand for Red Bull, but Germany has a law where you can't have sponsors in the name, which is why it's shortened to RB, so that people think it's Red Bull, but it's not. Side fact. Red Bull Salzburg, which is Austria, New York, and other places. And you also have like the Manchester City group, or the City Football Group, which is based on just Manchester City. There has three investors. It has one in China, one from New York, and the biggest one is one from I think Saudi Arabia, and they just own different kind of clubs. The main idea is you have a lot of funding and a lot of pool that you can have, but it gives them a lot of flexibility. So, for example, if you have a promising player in Manchester City, but he's not good enough to play in Manchester City, then you can send him to New York, where it's a less competitive league, where there are less good players, then you can have them develop there. So those are the benefits because you just own those kind of clubs. You have benefits of scouting. You can have different areas where you can see where up and coming players are, and you just have more flexibility in the front. As well as like if one club fails, there might be other clubs that still are profitable, and this is kind of like the benefit of it. But also the negative side of it is it's still again this corporate structure. So I think, for example, Citigroup tried to acquire a specific team in the Netherlands, which is called NAC Breda. It was in the second tier. It wasn't doing that great. But basically, what it says, no, we don't want this. We don't want to have this kind of like corporate culture. And they basically went for local culture instead. So they basically had local investors, so local shop owners who kind of like pooled the money together. And that's how they were able to resolve some of the issues that they had and get through. So it's from a fan standpoint, it's kind of like always complex because yes, you get money, but also you might lose the culture side of it. And it's sometimes a very specific way off that you need to make. Um, Another kind of thing I want to talk about financing is so basically the thing that you want to do is you want to make sure that teams don't spend too much money. Because if they spend billions and billions of dollars in the hope that they will some win the league or win the Champions League and then get all the money back, it kind of like becomes a race to the bottom. Because everyone will try to do that, because if they don't do it, they will definitely lose, and therefore they kind of like to do. So therefore, there's just rules in place which just set how much money you can play. This is financial fair play. Um, the thing is, this is necessarily a thing which is based on how much loss you run, which means that if you are a big club who's already doing well, then you can already just run more of a deficit, or you can just run bigger budgets because you just are a bigger club. If you're a smaller club, you kind of like are more restricted. There's less kind of like wiggle room that you have. There's kind of like a question of fairness, kind of like to a certain extent, it's just the capacity that you have to actually resolve the debt. To a certain extent, it's also just like you're kind of like locked into a very bad thing. And if you break these rules, what basically happens is if you have like a season, they remove the points that you've gotten, and they also on top of that put extra fines. So there are a couple of examples of this. So one of the ones are like Everton within the English Premier League, where basically it was a very simple case in which you had a lot of like just too much spending compared to what they got in. They basically confessed, yeah, we did that. They got the money taken away, and then they got the points tracked taken away. And that's basically how it happens. Something similar happened with another club in the Netherlands, Vitesse, who basically got all the points removed because they spent too much. They tried to do really well in like the European Cups as well, spent too much, and as a consequence, they also got relegated. They got a lot of fines. It was not nice. And the last club that I'm going to talk about is Manchester City. They have 115, actually they have 130 allegations of breaches of financial fair play. These are significantly more complex because these are things like, oh, the person that you hired as manager also has an advisory role in another company that you also own, and you pay him $1 million to give a speech where he didn't show up. And this just really looks like you just laundering money. And this is one of those things where it shows the complexity of football and sports, where you have a lot of like the reason why also why Manchester City is not being like prosecuted just yet is because they're really pushing back with a really big legal team. So it's the thing that they have a lot of money, and just the inherent nature of the investments makes it very, very complex to deal with and to prove. And therefore, they are not yet actually having their points deducted. They don't have their potential trophies and titles stripped away, or they haven't gotten their points taken away because it's so hard to do. And as a consequence of that, it kind of like shows kind of like the unfairness that happens when you have a very big company kind of like coming in, giving you a lot of money, and therefore being able to kind of like circumvent these rules. Whereas Everton, um, having their problems themselves, football and tactic style, at least, try to play more by the rules, did confess, and therefore did get more punished than Manchester City does. I think these are kind of like showing the problems that happens on the financial side. I already see that Jack has come in. I'm already 5 minutes slightly over time. So I'm not going to go talk about some other aspects that I want to talk about. I think for now, this is enough. So I'm going to give you the opportunity to ask any questions about anything I asked, or as I talked about, anything else that you want to know about. Um, yeah, as long as it's sports related, I'll try to find an answer.